Welcome back to my channel. We're doing part 2 to Grandpa's Farm of Scary Stories from the subreddit Stay Awake. So, last line I read was, "What the hell is that?" I said aloud. Shining the flashlight down at the mush, I was stunned to find a conglomeration of shattered bones, feathers, and green slime. As I continued to look down at the sludge that was formerly a chicken, I felt my stomach churn and fought the urge to vomit. I made it just outside the barn before it came up, and once I had regained my composure, I ran to the house to get Grandpa. "Beats any damn thing I ever saw," the old man said a few minutes later as he inspected the remains himself. "We better take a count and see if there's any more birds missing." In total, 3 birds had been killed, the remains of the 2 I had found in the laying room, but the other we never located. The whole thing baffled both Grandpa and me, but it was only just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, it became a regular occurrence to find that anywhere from 1 to 3 chickens had succumbed to the same fate, and eventually the growing loss of the birds began to take its toll on Grandfather. He became withdrawn, and his former patience all but disappeared. More than once, he'd come short with me over the smallest things, but I couldn't blame the man. The chickens were his livelihood, and with each passing day, that livelihood was being dealt a massive blow. Something had to be done and about it for my grandpa's sake. As soon enough, I came up with a plan. One night later that week, I waited for Grandpa to go to bed. When I was satisfied he was asleep, I grabbed a flashlight and headed out to the barn. The building's hayloft had been modified so that my grandfather could go up and look down on the flock from above. But tonight, it would serve as a good vantage point in which to spy on any would-be intruders. Entering the barn and then climbing the ladder, I laid down, prone on the dusty loft floor. The entire laying room was visible from where I was positioned, and nothing should be able to see me from the ground. I just had to be quiet and wait. A couple of hours passed, and I was just about to give up my vigil when I heard the barn door open. Momentarily, Zeke entered the room carrying an old lantern. At first, I wondered what he was doing there, but then I realized he was probably just checking on things, or so I thought. I watched the man look around the room, and then he began walking up and down the rows of nesting boxes. After a bit, Zeke had set his lantern on the floor, reached into one of the boxes, and then brought out one of the large red birds. The sudden interruption of its slumber caused the chicken to panic, and the bird began to cluck frantically while flapping its wings. The other birds began to stir nervously, but before they could get too worked up, Zeke reached up and snapped the captive chicken's neck. The dying bird beat its wings a few more times, and then became still. From my hiding place, I watched with shock as the farmhand took the dead bird by the feet and then held it above his head while staring up at it. With several sickening pops, Zeke's bottom jaw began to unhinge itself. Oh boy. While the rest of his mouth stretched out into a gaping maw. Once fully extended, I noticed row upon row of sharp, quill-like teeth circling the cavernous hole that was formerly Zeke's mouth. With horror, I watched as the man began lowering the chicken into the horrible orifice. And as the bird slowly disappeared down its gullet, Zeke's throat and chest bulged out grotesquely. I'm getting sick to my stomach currently. As the bird continued its descent, the muffled sound of flesh and bone being torn from one another emanated from deep inside the hired hand. Oh my God, this makes me sick, but I gotta finish. By this point, everything in me screamed, "Run!" But the thought of what that hideous mouth might do to a human kept me paralyzed a little longer. The chicken had now reached Zeke's stomach, and the man's torso convulsed violently as it digested the bird. Shortly, the man's spasms stopped. With his gruesome mouth still wide open, the farmhand vomited up the undigested remains. Unable to turn away, my own gorge began to rise, and I fought hard not to puke. In the meantime, Zeke had moved on to another nesting box. There was no way I wanted to stick around for the second course, so deciding to take advantage of Zeke's momentary distraction, I started my getaway. Unfortunately, in my rush, I kicked over the flashlight. Terror filled every ounce of my being as I watched it roll over the edge and then fall to the floor below. The crash of it stopped Zeke as he was reaching for another bird. He looked momentarily down at the busted flashlight and then up toward where I hid. He searched the darkness of the loft with wide, non-human eyes, and I froze. Hoping like hell he couldn't see me. With panic-laced anticipation, I waited to see what Zeke would do next, but was relieved when the farmhand turned and ran out the door. For a long while, I just stared there, afraid to move. I wanted to go get Grandpa, but what if Zeke was still lurking around somewhere outside? The thought of that and what the man might do if he caught me made me stay where I was. Eventually, the first rays of the dawning sun crept through the barn windows, and I figured it was finally safe to leave the loft. As I climbed down, I scanned the barn for any signs of Zeke. Seeing nothing, I ran back to the house. "Been out checking the flock, have you?" My grandfather asked wearily as I came through the kitchen door. I only nodded, having no idea what to tell him. "Well, what'd you find?" he asked impatiently. Wondering if he'd even believe me, I made the quick decision to keep quiet about Zeke for the moment anyway. "Just one last night," I told him nervously. Grandpa only nodded his head and went about making breakfast. We never saw Zeke again after that night. The man, or whatever he was, had fled without taking any of his belongings. The suddenness of the man's leaving seemed to leave Grandpa with a feeling of confusion, but to me, it was a blessing. With Zeke gone, my grandfather would never have to know about what I had witnessed. The final 2 weeks of my stay were uneventful. Thankfully, no more chickens died, but even though things more or less went back to normal, the experience in the barn had stunted my newfound love of the farm. Needless to say, I was glad when my parents came to pick me up. They couldn't believe how much I had changed, and they were right. After that summer, video games and movies just didn't interest me as much. Instead, I put my focus on other things, such as spending time with my family and getting close to Grandpa. It was a good thing considering he died 2 years later. After Grandpa John passed, I found myself thinking back to that night at his farm, and what I had witnessed was Zeke. What was he? And were others like him? I decided I needed answers, and since then, I've scoured the internet and searched countless books. While I've yet to find out exactly what the farmhand was, one thing is certain. My dad was right. There really is a whole world out there, and it can be scary as hell. That's the end of the story. I'm gonna go be sick now. Just that description. Ugh. Anyways, if you enjoyed the part 2, I know it's shorter than the first one, but if you enjoyed part 2, please leave a like or a thumbs up. And if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe and turn on the bell notification. I'll see ya in the next video.